I'm going to talk about fascism, but not fascism in the sense, and we've been having this discussion since a couple of years now. Whenever you use the word fascism, or whenever I use the word fascism, there's always someone that says, yeah, but okay, I get that there is a new surge of the far right, but this is not fascism, right? And you're like, why not? Well, because fascism is when you have people with boots and uniforms in the streets. Or fascism is when they knock at your door at 3 a.m. and then you disappear into a labor camp. And I think it's interesting because it's a description of fascism that engages with the way fascism appears, or with the aesthetics of fascism. And one of the problems with this new surge, or this new resurgence of fascism as a cultural force, is that it doesn't look fascist. It looks actually very non-fascist. And this is what I wanted to discuss today, and I wanted to engage with this material with you. Please feel free to ask questions whenever you feel that you really have like a pressing question to ask. You can just raise your hands and I can stop for a second, it's not a problem. So, to begin, in his famous essay, Discourse on Colonialism, poet Aimé Césaire argued that what in Europe is called fascism is just colonial violence finding its way back home. The carceral state, ethno-nationalism, imperial warfare are, one could argue, different facets of what Nikhil Pal Singh called the afterlife of fascism. Rather than the absolute opposite of totalitarianism, democracy can accommodate a totalitarian dimension. The golden decades of social democracy in the West, for instance, were coterminous with racial oppression at home and colonial violence abroad. And the same state can address certain groups of people biopolitically, managing their lives, whilst other groups are submitted to a necropolitical regime, suppressed, criminalized, and ultimately killed or left to die. You have a good example here with this image that was actually taken by a photographer to testify to the plight of the migrant refugee caravan that was entering or trying to enter the European Union via the Balkans, the border in the Balkans, and it was then appropriated by the Leave campaign in Britain, and it became an image not for the plight of the refugees, but used as an emblem of the refugee as a threat to white Europe and to the white civilization in Europe. Whilst the missing link between settler colonialism and National Socialism is still vastly under-theorized, in the depoliticized atmosphere of post-89, a great deal of intellectual effort was devoted to conceptualizing emancipation in a manner that would involve freedom from the masses rather than freedom for the masses. In the resulting retreat from collective organization, mobilization, and militancy, connectivity and the digital platforms which afford it were fetishized as enabling a form of grassroots network-based democracy. However, and as Jody cautions, by virtue of its individuating effects, the network as a nihilistic rather than an emancipatory potential. The most salient feature of the far-right movement, which became known as the alt-right, is its relation with information technologies, rather than with the diminished expectations of the post-industrial working class. This, I would argue, points to a new configuration of fascist ideology taking shape under the edges of and working in tandem with neoliberal governance, within which whiteness functions as an anti-political concept, a structure of affect that leads those who are hurt economically to invest themselves nonetheless, libidinally and symbolically. And I just wanted to share this image of the campaign that was it's a poster for the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, and the slogan means "New Germans, we make them ourselves." So basically, like you can only be German if you are, like Caucasian, and it's very interesting because, like the woman itself is reduced to a wound. She has no face. So basically, you only see this mouth, which is a bit of like an obscene orifice. It's of course like standing in place of the other obscene orifice that is not revealed in the image, but it's quite, it's implied or it's connoted. And not only, I mean, it's an image that is interesting because it's extremely racist, but it's also extremely misogynistic. So it really stands at the intersection of these two currents. And then, of course, the aspirational side, which is the image that Ivanka Trump posted when they announced that the children were being separated at the border. So you always have these two aspects, like the denigrating and the debasement and abjection of the non-white, and then the aspirational image of whiteness carefully crafted and constructed. If every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution, one could say that the rise of cryptofascist tendencies within the tech industry bears witness to the failures of the digital revolution, whose premises of a post-scarcity economy and socialized capital never came to pass. And this is the reason why I believe the present moment, which could be defined by a process of de-Westernization, meaning that the West is rapidly losing its position of dominance, and there is an ongoing dispute over the geopolitical control of the colonial extraction matrix, gave rise to an intense preoccupation with the future, or lack thereof, and to a great many reformist or reactionary forms of progressivism claiming that the future has been stolen, stalled, or otherwise evacuated, and hence must be reclaimed. But here you have a good example of this idea that, we have to claim back our future. Rather than express disenchantment with the declining valence of futurity, I would find it worth exploring how temporality functions as a proxy for whiteness and empire. The notion of contemporaneity as object of economical and emotional investment is a function of a linear representation of time which divides chronology into the distinct moments of past, present, and future. But this articulation of difference hinges on and intersects with another articulation of difference, racial difference. All the markers of modernity, progress, development, modernization, industrialization, urbanization, acculturation, suggest a comparative chronology. What anthropologist Johannes Fabian calls the denial of coevalness exonerates and rationalizes ever-increasing power asymmetries by ascribing different populations to different temporalities, and ultimately consigning those in the global south to the waiting room of history. From this perspective, geopolitics could be said to be a form of chronopolitics. And because the non-Europeans are hopelessly behind the times, successive waves of colonial depredation are, to this day, justified by the necessity to assimilate to modernity, to catch up. As Eugene Macara notes, capitalism is an eschatological tale as well as a form of political economy, offering its own story of human fulfillment. For capitalist eschatology, salvation implies inclusion in the here and now of the marketplace. Theft, or that which is stolen, via enslavement, land grabs, depredation, or plunder, can be thus codified as a gift or offering, as the dispensation of contemporaneity. The future is a function of this colonial relation, which ties hierarchy to temporality. And this is the reason why I believe these gestures towards temporal transcendence fail to yield any meaningful movement, metaphysical or otherwise, which would signal a departure from the liberal subject that undergirdis settler capitalism. In her essay Other Worlds, the persistence of race in movement beyond the human, Zakiya Iman Jackson cautions that appeals to move beyond the human often leave unexamined the temporal and spatial destinations which connote this beyond. Temporality is always a political construct, even more so when it entails a movement of the mind. And the mobilization of temporality as a form of transcendence, Jackson argues, may actually, and I quote, Reintroduced European transcendentalism, this movement purports to disrupt, particularly with regards to the historical and ongoing distributive ordering of race, which authorizes and conditions appeals to the beyond, maybe even over-determining the beyond's appeal, end quote. The very question of the beyond here, as a marker for temporal transcendence, not only returns us to the racialized metaphysical terrain of orders of being, temporality, spatiality, and knowledge, it reveals that we never left. And as a rule, the same appeals to move beyond the human do not imply a movement towards the non-human. They simply prescribe a movement towards technology. This is the case because, at present, the survival of Western hegemony hinges on the digital economy, or more precisely, on the development of artificial intelligence, the only fast-growing sector at present, and the sole compelling attempt to project another phase of capitalist accumulation beyond the already exhausted neoliberal one. From a market perspective, artificial intelligence is a reformist project. It promises to restore declining profit margins. But the digital economy also changes the process through which technology is accumulated as capital, and the resulting class relation is at odds with the social reproduction of the American way of life. Just to explain very briefly this point, there's lots of forms of you can organize the economy in lots of ways in which you produce a wealthy class and a class that is not wealthy, that is kept in poverty. Not all of these forms of political or social, economic or political organization are capitalist, right? And there's a huge discussion whether we are still living through, whether what we are living through right now can properly be called capitalism or not. Of course, if you define capitalism as an economy that is structured in a relation between capital owners and wage earners, then we are clearly going through a process of transition. Because at the moment the economy is really shifting towards a rentier model. So basically a model that people usually would use the term digital feudalism, because it's similar to the feudal model in the sense that ownership of resources is restricted to very few people that then rent out the access to these resources to the many. To let the private sector, Amazon, Google, which just bought DeepMind, Facebook, IBM, or Microsoft, function as the sole providers of essential public services implies a fundamental division between the tech-savvy gentry and a vast underclass of underemployed or precariously employed. Yielding the authority of the unscrutable, the alliance between finance and digital tech leads to a dramatic restoration of corporate profit and elite power. Hence the billions being devoted to applications of marginal utility for reasons of reducing the bargaining power of labor. A prime example for this is, for instance, the drive for autonomous cars to replace human drivers, when potentially groundbreaking applications are grossly underfunded. Though this trend towards what several theorists have called planetary apartheid is not a novelty, it has found a renewed intensity as the capital accumulated in industrial advanced countries, and here I'm quoting from Chris Chen, scores the globe for lower wages, preventing the development of so-called peripheral formations and reappearing as the racial threat of cheap labor from the global south, end quote. As social rights wither in Europe and the US, a massive security apparatus is in the process of being consolidated to manage the supposed civilizational threats to the nation. Under the banner of the war on terror, the policing of racialized lives at home converges with the renewed intensity of colonial violence abroad, instituting a structure of affect that leads those who are hurt economically to still invest themselves nonetheless. Millennials in particular are nudged to align their identities with startups and social media platforms, much as their parents did with the American dream and its promises of upward mobility. and to misrecognize technological affordance as a form of temporal and by extension social transcendence. Whiteness, one could say, functions as the libidinal glue that holds this wealth of incongruities together. This is an example of the flag of Kyrgyzstan, which is a fictional country that appeared in 4chan or was invented in 4chan. And this is the campaign for Matteo Salvini in Milan. Not all social tensions find political expression. They do, however, take up a form. They align themselves with or attach themselves to objects, idioms, or tropes. As media theorist Florian Kramer sustains, the alt-right can be described as a tangle of semi-compatible ideological formations clustered around a meme-producing machine, arguably its real center of power. These ideologies might not cohere politically, yes, they do cohere aesthetically, into an emotional structure whose content ceases to be subjective once it begins to constitute the ground of subject formation. This is during the Trump campaign, a supporter of Trump holding a sign that says Green Lives Matter, so basically clearly sarcastically referencing the Black Lives Matter campaign. And the frog in the picture is Pepe the Frog, who I believe you are familiar with. Kramer coined the term weaponization of carnival to describe the phenomenon the alt-right calls meme magic, referring to Batkin's theory of the carnival as the interface between a stasis imposed from above and a desire for change from below, between the official and the unofficial. Kramer describes meme culture as a carnival in an almost literal sense, with all the actors involved, from the anonymous movement to Andrew Weave, our miner, Milo Yiannopoulos, Sam Hyde, InfoWars, or Donald Trump, adopting the carnivalesque as a register, whose essential principle is degradation, or, to directly quote Batkin, the lowering of all that is high, spiritual, ideal, abstract, to the material level, to the sphere of the bodily lower stratum. Carnival, as Terry Eagleton argues, involves a vulgar, shameless materialism of the body, belly, buttock, anus, genitals, which rides rampant over ruling class civilities. This is why the infamous statement, grab her by the pussy, according to Kramer, rather than repulsing potential voters, energized the Trump campaign, becoming one of its central memes. But the character of this process of degradation is not purely negative, lowering the symbolic status of its targets via a debasement through rape, also, conversely, raises the status of those doing it. Alt-right satire is not simply about opposing oneself to the object of mockery, but also about placing oneself above it. This aspirational element is as crucial as the libidinal aspect for what could be described as the relation of law and liberation in the alt-right carnival. Though this relationship is, I would argue, wholly undialectical, the alt-right's transgressive ethos and anti-establishment sentiment allowed it easy passage into social spheres not traditionally aligned with or sympathetic to the far right. Just a note about this image. This is Taylor Swift posing with a DJ friend in the birthday party for Katy Perry. And the pictures were circulated by the Daily Mail, and Taylor Swift, of course, apologized and said it was a joke, it was all in jest. And she had no idea that her friend was sporting a swastika in his t-shirt. But her dress has the initials JH, which in neo-Nazi forums means Jew hatred. So, I mean, it signals a certain level of, let's say, knowledge that is not really private to the most of the people. In the anti-political atmosphere of post-89, as I already mentioned, A great deal of intellectual effort was devoted to conceptualizing political emancipation in a manner that evades the stubbornly persistent questions of party organization and militancy. In this retreat from the collective and embrace of the new, there has been a tremendous amount of exuberance from nominally left academics, sometimes with shares paid for by tech companies, about the radical potential of new media. The alt-rights proved appealing to these liberal pundits vast segments of the para-academia and the contemporary art milieu because, owing to a vulgar delusionism, hybridity, ambivalence, and the performative are taken to be by definition polysemic, hence anti-authoritarian. Alt-right idioms, tropes, and jargon crept into contemporary art venues with extraordinary ease because, as many argued at the time, this visual vocabulary is in flux, hence as a generative potential whose emancipatory credentials are self-evident. Just to show an example, we are just going to talk about this in a second. Irony is said to imply heteroglossia, and from this perspective, coarse racism and boorish sorrowing can be read as anti-normative or anti-conformist, as having an edgy or defiant sheen, oppositional to mainstream taste, or as a form of cultural jamming, endowed with subversive potential. Social media expression, and virtually everything which can be described as rhizomatic or disruptive, tend to be fetishized as a form of network-enabled grassroots democracy. The intensity, intoxicating vitality, and almost ecstatic mode of experience the left is said to lack is what the alt-right has to offer. For fields like contemporary art, whose narrative identity is, as already mentioned, predicated on doing something that is not of the norm, this offer proved enticing. Now, the most glaring example of this, and I am not going to go in depth about this because Kojo, who's from London, probably can explain better what happened there than me, was this gallery called LD50 in Dalston that was directly organizing white supremacist events. But these far-right materials that they were circulating, which included the video Elliot Rodgers shot before his murderous rampage, and a slogan or the emblems of the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, which is the white supremacist organization in South Africa, do not stand out as an anomaly. On the contrary, they cohere with the broader ethos of post-internet art and with the restorative impulse, which undergirds accelerationism. One can also find, and this is what I wanted to share with you, these are examples of Vaporwave, in which one can also find this type of nostalgia fix. And Vaporwave was called by Andrew Anglin, the founder of the Daily Stormer, the whitest music ever, combining these joyful promises of early 90s internet culture into a style that feels completely unmoored from politics and history. There is a futurism in this art, as Vice magazine described it, insofar as it is styled as a 1980s retrofuturism, featuring DeLoreans and Tron-like virtual landscapes, end quote. So from Greco-Roman imagery to New Age esoterica or cyber obscurantism, the intersection between post-internet aesthetics, accelerationism, meme culture, and the rhetoric of white anxiety create a milieu in which a growing number of university-educated urban professionals who hold positions in historical liberal institutions seem to be breaking right. Not outright fascist, this sensibility is what I would call fascist curious, insofar as it does not imply a coherent political design, but rather a presubjective investment. Overall, this is the rhetoric of the symptom, though I would add, not merely in the sense of a ciphered message. The symptom, according to Lacan, is a sexual act. It can only be defined as a way in which each subject enjoys the unconscious, albeit this enjoyment may not be consciously experienced as such. I just want to go through these images very quickly. Here you see the evolution of Vaporwave into a subset or a substyle called Fascwave. And basically, the Greco-Roman statuary is already present, as it is like this fantasy of, like this post-digital utopia that was promised in the 90s. And then you see how it very easily bleeds into or merges with this aesthetics of the alt-right, where you start to have a certain dark, like the tonalities, the tones become darker, and there's an emphasis on more stark vectors. So the image is not as flowy as it was in the previous example. It becomes more unidirectional. And then you also have different levels or different gradations of, how can I say, explicitness? Or this one already incorporates the emblem of Identity Europa, which is this nativist movement that rose in Europe in the last 5 years. And this one is clearly claiming, like you see in the upper corner, art-right. So it's clearly claiming this position, the positionality in the art world. And this is the actual image or the actual iconography of Identity Europa. Europa with V. But we stay a little bit with Vaporwave. Though often associated with the theme of conflict with the social order, which defines the counterculture, the desire to subvert or transgress moral codes does not necessarily have a politics. It is rather contingent to the current consensus. The rhetoric of transgression can also be largely unmoored from the politics of transgression, as it is the case with the Nazi exploitation film, whose primary drive is to link political and sexual deviance. In the 60s and 70s, fascism also provided a ready-made outlet for fantasies that link power to sexuality, like dominance and submission or sadomasochism. Social democracy had, in those decades, and in many ways still has, a fascist libido, erotically speaking. Here, and in a great many other examples, the Manson family being the most extreme, transgression could be said to swiftly curdle into sadism. In the field of contemporary art, transgression became a genre which produced mostly cynical attempts to render aesthetic experience a direct extension of moral outrage. But most importantly, transgression as an economic dimension correlated to the doctrine of creative destruction, or what Silicon Valley, or what in Silicon Valley vernacular is called disruption, a pivotal theme in the nexus between the counterculture and the tech or the computer culture. In the last 2 decades, after the left won the cultural wars, transgression was swiftly weaponized and deployed against so-called political correctness by many fringe elements on the conservative right, a trend that is now known as the alt-right. But there is a wider cultural convergence between theory, lifestyle, and an attitude of scornful or jaded negativity in the genre known as post-irony, which arches back to what Mark Greif termed the white hipster. The white hipster, Greif sustained, fetishized the violence, instinctiveness, and rebelliousness of lower-middle-class white trash. Figures like Vice founder Gavin McInnes, who told the Times journalist in 2003, "I love being white and I think it's something to be proud of," or hoaxer Sam Hyde, whose show $1 Million Extreme Presents World Peace, opened on Cartoon Network, Adult Swim, with Hyde in blackface, stand at the intersection between the stoner, the nerd, and the white supremacist. Just as a side note, Gavin McInnes was caught in this video that showed this group, the Proud Boys, attacking demonstrations in New York. And now he actually denounced this, now he came out saying that he is no longer a white supremacist and he wishes to distance himself from the movement. Whereas the traditional usage of the term alternative signals a position that is skeptical of and in some ways incompatible with power, the alternative in outright points towards a counterculture that yearns for tradition, or in other words, a libertarian resistance with an authoritarian program. Often used to express skepticism, irony has also long been perceived as a tool of subversion, the locus of a questioning attitude which is theretofore aligned with political progressiveness. Irony can indeed allow one to express distrust or dissent under taxing or outright perilous circumstances that preclude other forms of political expression. But irony can also mask complicity, and above all, irony is a defense mechanism. Psychoanalytically speaking, irony minimizes the object while maximizing the subject's self-contentment and sense of superiority. By tacitly implying the opposite of what is literally said, irony also allows one to sustain a position of moral or political ambivalence, as you see. This position is coextensive with the anti-political stance of the professional managerial class and its ambivalence vis-à-vis the rise of fascism. Willing to surrender political power to populists and demagogues of the far right in order to protect its economic interests, the affluent or relatively affluent Western middle classes also have an ambivalent relation with capitalism, typically theorized as an aleatory and chaotic force able to unleash, and I quote, powerful utopian energies whose alienating effects can be experienced as liberating. Trump, as Joe Didin argued, illustrates the truth of economic inequality, and I quote, civility is for the middle class. The wealthy no longer need to pretend they care. The underpaid are not able to enjoy the privilege of immense wealth, but they can still enjoy the resulting inequality. Now, I'd like to share the last image with you. Though by no means privileged at home, a stag party from Manchester can afford to pay a homeless Polish man to get his forehead tattooed with the groom's name. This is the joy afforded by capital, even to those it exploits. Ultimately, and as Frank Wilderson argued, if workers can buy a loaf of bread, they can also buy a slave. It's all down to pricing differentials. And if all else fails, you can still feel like an Englishman, a member of a dominant group by virtue of race and nation. From this perspective, welfare chauvinism and the libidinal investment in racism and misogyny are perfectly rational. Politically speaking, they point to the path of least resistance, if not the only open avenue, to preserve a modicum of social status. We could thus say that, and from this perspective, the online cultural wars are a proxy for a greater battle around de-Westernization, imperialism, and loss of hegemony. Tech culture adopts the attitude of the hacker counterculture, while aligning itself with the dominant class, and thus opens up a poisonous conduit between the two. So to sum up, one cannot vote for Trump ironically, one can vote for Trump sincerely, or one can vote for Trump cynically. In 2003, Frederick Jameson famously said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. For a vast majority of the mostly white and relatively affluent population, unburdened by centuries of persecution, the end of the world is, unconsciously or semi-consciously, preferable to the end of the privilege afforded by racial capitalism. Thank you.